talk about today is first, these issues, as far as I'm concerned, are related directly to ethics. And I want to talk a bit about how that fits in. And then I wanted to go through some background, and the background has to do with the evolution of my thinking to get me to this point. And then the third thing is how I have learned from students while I was in Bangkok. And then finally, the fourth part is just some thoughts about where we can move next, or at least where I'm heading at present. So first, with the ethics portion of this, I was quite taken with a quote from the late, unfortunately, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She gave a talk at Stanford, I think 3 or 4 years ago. And in it, she said, if you want to be a true professional, you will do something outside yourself, something to repair the tears in your community, something to make life a little better for people less fortunate than you. Well, two things struck me there. One, the first word that struck me is, okay, what is a true professional? And I think it's important for us to understand how it is that our profession relates to and what its responsibilities are to the community. And of course, the second word is, what is this community that we're talking about? And a lot of that reminded me of community architecture, and going back as far as the old Architects Renewal Committee of Harlem back in 1964. And then from that, the rise of community architecture all over the world. I would say a lot of focus on the US and the UK. It was in that context of community architecture, and in particular, the work of John F.C. Turner, that really inspired me in architecture more than the magazines did. So there are a number of questions here in ethics. The first of which I would say is, what should we be doing? And this relates specifically to our professional responsibilities. But it's also our responsibilities as individuals, and the responsibilities we have to each other as citizens. We need to have a set of principles that guide our actions. Well, what are those principles going to be? And this is something that Hossein has been talking about for many years too. We have a basis in, if we study ethics, the thing that comes out of that as a foundation is a set of principles. This is how we should act. And there's a whole range of people over the last, 2+ millennia who have been asking that very question. Well, I think there's a lot we can learn from the study of ethics, and how the principles that are derived from that can guide our actions as professionals and as citizens. So within the profession itself, as you can see on this matrix on the right, the architectural profession sees responsibilities in a much more specific and legalistic framework. And it's not exactly that I'm talking about. We can read contracts fairly easily, but the principles behind those contracts are something else again. And it's those principles, I think, that we need to get at and understand better. Because typically, I think in my conversations with architects, those principles are typically assumed. We don't give them a great deal of thought. We just expect that something is there, and we have a matrix that tells us what we must do, and we don't think too far beyond that. When we start to pull those principles out and understand them better, our actions, I think, change, and that's an important aspect of what we mean, I think, by a rights-based approach, as the UN has referred to it for some time now. The other side to that is not as much what should we do, but what won't you do? And I think Raphael Sperry, who heads up ADPSR in San Francisco, has done a lot of work on this in terms of that prison boycott that you can read about on their website. When he started talking about the prison boycott, or the boycott of prison design, it raised in my mind, where is that line? If it's one thing to say, okay, I don't want to do prisons, but other people might, I was actually involved in prison, in a renovation in a prison at one point, and believe me, I never wanted to do that again. It's just terrible. But these buildings occur. If we want to change how we think about that, we have to say at some point, what won't I do? Where is this line that I have that I said, no, I'm not touching that. That goes beyond my principles. Well, what are they? Where do you draw the line? And the other example I have here, of course, is Albert Speer, who, if you read his book, Inside the Third Reich, he was 28 years old when he was given this fantastic opportunity, you might say, as a designer to do fantastic buildings and cities, for heaven's sakes. And he got caught up in that because, in part, as he said, for a commission like that, I would have sold my soul like Mephistopheles. And he did, because he didn't have that line where he would say, no, I can't do this. If you don't have that line, then you will do anything. So where do you stop? I think it's a really important question, not just what should you do, but what won't you do? And then the third part here is, what then must we do? And this comes from Tolstoy's book of the same name. And he got that from the Bible, Luke 3:10. It was also echoed much later in the movie, The Year of Living Dangerously. It was one of the themes, I would say, of that film. Because we need to determine the actions that we are about to take. When we see what we see in front of us, as Tolstoy did when he went through the slums of Moscow in the late 1800s. What do we do now? Given what we see in front of us, what are we going to do? We have to be able to answer that question. And that too has to be based on a set of principles. So what are they? Well, when I was teaching this in Bangkok, and a lot of the books, like the Wasserman quote or reference I've got here, a lot of these books bring it down to these four basic concepts of the first of which is virtue ethics, which defines a good or flourishing life. But here, you know, what we're talking about is the individual's life. And similarly, with Kant's groundwork in the metaphysics of morals, we're also dealing with duties that individuals have to each other, which starts to get us into the nature of community. With utilitarianism, it enlarges that scope, I would say, to the greatest good for the greatest number. You know, it's not just about individuals and what we want or need. It's about communities as well, and the inclusion of others in our moral thinking. And then finally, we have Rousseau with rights-based theory, and that captured my attention. It's not that I ignore the other theories of ethics, but this one seemed to me to capture a lot more of what we're dealing with in terms of responsibilities and rights, in terms of how it is that we live together. It's one thing to talk about how you can have a flourishing life of your own, but how does a whole community flourish? And there, it seemed to me that rights began to answer those questions more effectively than other theories did. So I began to focus on that a bit. I have to say, I suppose that before I went to architecture school, I did a degree in English and philosophy. So everything I do is affected by those beginnings, those intellectual beginnings. So when we're talking about rights, well, this concept has expanded greatly, obviously, since Rousseau in the 1760s. And in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with the UN put together these 30 articles in the Declaration. I think the first 20 or 21 of which are dealing more with political and civil rights. So you can see here, number 21 is taking part in government, which has to do with participation. I'll get into that in a second. Then 22 through 27 are dealing more with economic, social, and cultural rights. And then finally, the last three have to do with administrative commitments that the state has to these rights. So when I started looking at that, well, I started to focus on number 25, and I'll get into that in just a minute as well. So, background. I was lucky enough as an architecture student at the University of British Columbia to still be a student when Habitat came to town. The first UN Habitat conference was in Vancouver. I spent a lot of time at the Habitat Forum. This was the first time, actually, that the UN allowed for this parallel kind of conference to go on with the official conference. So in the official conference, what you had were delegates from all the different countries, but at the Habitat Forum, which was held down on Jericho Beach in Vancouver, it was a much looser confederation of people who came and spoke, including John F. C. Turner, and Paolo Soleri was there. I can't remember. Barbara Ward was there. So we, as architecture students, had a fantastic opportunity to listen to what was actually going on to do with these issues of habitat. Out of the Habitat Conference, there were a number of recommendations that came out of the Vancouver Declaration. And the one that I have highlighted here is public participation as a right. Well, what does that mean? And actually, one of the things I did just recently is submit a paper to the UIA conference specifically about that, trying to figure out, okay, let's unpack these words and see what it might mean. So as a student then, looking at these issues and many of the broader issues that had to do with habitat, this was an expanding period of my student life, I have to say. And I started thinking more and more about the relationship between architecture and these broader issues. What focused some of my attention when I was doing a master's in architecture had to do with the Fair Housing Act in the US. And the fact that in 1988, the Fair Housing Amendments Act included the prohibition of discrimination on the basis not just of race, color, and creed, and so on, but to people with disabilities and families with children. And I thought, well, here's where the relationship between the Civil Rights Act of 1968, because the Fair Housing Act sits under the Civil Rights Act. Here's where rights relate to what we do as designers, because if we're designing to accommodate or to avoid discrimination against people with disabilities, then our design has to be better than it is right now. So there's a connection here between that Civil Rights Act and these issues of accessibility, universal design, and so on. And I thought, well, okay, what is this connection between civil rights and disabilities? Well, obviously, certainly for the Fair Housing Act, at least, this has to do with how we respond to people with disabilities. And that's certainly a design issue. Well, what other design issues relate then to civil rights? Or, as I learned eventually, more to economic, social, and cultural rights. Well, I was in a way haunted by Article 25 of the Universal Declaration. In that Article 25, as you can see here, I've highlighted the word housing. And ultimately, that's what my master's thesis was about. How is it that architecture relates directly to that basic need, and specifically housing? Because obviously, architects are doing housing. So how does that relate to that Universal Declaration of Human Rights? What is it that we do that relates to that? How is our profession addressing that basic issue? Well, as it turned out, we're not really. We will take a commission, and if the commission is from, say, a government body, and that government body says we need to have affordable housing, well then, we're willing to take that commission. Sorry, my dog is barking out. So if we're willing to take that commission, we're doing something basically for money. We're not doing it on the basis of a set of principles. I want to know what the principles are. Why would you do this, and how can you make that work better? What is it about our skills, our professional skills, that relates directly to this, and how can we support that right as a professional? Well, as I went through that thinking, it struck me that a lot of that has to come down to the institutional recognition of that right. In other words, we have to get our architectural bodies, like the RIBA, say, or internationally, the UIA. We have to get those jurisdictional bodies to recognize that right, and what the profession as a whole then has to do, is obliged to do. What should we do given that housing is increasingly unaffordable? What are we going to do as a profession? So it has a lot more than to do with those bodies, the jurisdictional bodies, than it does with individual actions. The individual actions, of course, are important, and that comes down to things like, what is it to have a flourishing life? But it's more than that. It's how institutions respond to the needs of the citizens to whom they have a responsibility. In fact, in most places, it's a legislated responsibility. So I focused in on Article 25 and started unpacking that, just that word housing, and how we respond as a profession. Well, when I started teaching in Bangkok in '98, I wanted to do something that related the curriculum to community architecture. There has to be something in the curriculum that allows us to better understand those architectural responses to the needs of a community. Instead of waiting for government commissions, say, can we not be more proactive? Well, one of the places that we start being proactive as a profession is in the schools. So when I started teaching, that's why I wanted to teach. Is okay, let's unpack the curriculum and find out what's in here and how we can manipulate that, change it in some way so that we better respond to the responsibilities that ethics shows us that we have as professionals. So I started doing this community design studio when I first arrived there. And we were working, well, what the catalyst for that was the 1999 UIA Congress held in Beijing. At every Congress, they hold a student competition. And the particular competition that was held in Beijing for the Beijing Congress was to do with the Habitat Agenda. The Habitat Agenda was from the Habitat 2 conference in Istanbul. And I thought, because I attended the Istanbul conference, I thought, gee, this is a perfect opportunity for us to, look at that Habitat Agenda and connect that to what we do as architects. And I figured, well, who else was going to look at this? Because all of these UN documents keep getting pumped out, but, how are they distributed and who reads them? Well, I got my students to go through them. And what I did is I told the students, okay, if we're going to apply the Habitat Agenda in our community, as expected by this student competition, well, where are we going to apply it? Go find some places where this could be applied. And that's how I wound up learning an enormous amount from my students about all of these different communities in Bangkok that where the needs were far greater than we might normally see, certainly as a tourist, or even as the middle class. So I started doing this every year. About 3 years into that, I think 2001, one of the communities that we were directed towards by another NGO in town was the Pamnahakan community. They were facing the threat of eviction from the planners of Bangkok. And the planners of Bangkok had this grand idea in mind, a master plan, in fact, where they wanted to change the inner core of the old city of Bangkok, Ratanakosin. This is where the Grand Palace is and so on. They wanted to change that into something that would reflect, I think, more the monarchy, and they wanted to change this road here, Ratchadamnern, into the Champs-Élysées. Well, why the Champs-Élysées? What's the point to that? But if all of your planners and architects, in this case, are often trained in the UK or the US, well, they're steeped, and this brings us to decolonizing education. They're steeped in basically Western architecture, and so they think of the Champs-Élysées as, well, this is just beautiful. We need to do something like that here too. They used to call Bangkok the Venice of the East. Why? Yes, they've got canals, but this is not Venice. This is Bangkok. It's quite different. There are many things here that the communities have developed in Bangkok that were not developed in the history of Venice. They're just different places and different cultures. So why do we have to copy these things? Well, the other part to this is not just about beautification, as important as that was to the planners, but it was also about improving land values. And in improving land values, you have to get rid of the slums. And in this little area here, you can see my cursor, this is where the Pamnahakan community lived for about 150 plus years. They knew this area very well, and they were facing, because of the Ratanakosin master plan, they were facing eviction, threats of eviction over and over again from the 90s on up. We started working with this community to to determine what it is that they wanted to do in their community to, number one, improve their physical conditions, improve their economic conditions, but also to meet some of the needs that were recognized by the Ratanakosin Master Plan. So we spent about 2.5 months working in the community and going through what buildings were to be kept, what buildings could be renovated, what buildings may need to be removed, and so on, and relating that to the overall master plan that the planners had come up with. Now, of course, the community really had no clear idea of what that master plan was, because, you know, the planning department doesn't talk to the slum dwellers. All they want to do is just get rid of them, period. You know, we don't have to talk to you. But after, you know, spending months with this community, you know, their needs were not that far off from the grand needs of the Ratanakosin Master Plan. They wanted their community to be better too. They wanted, you know, more park space if they could get it. Some of these things were very much like the Ratanakosin Master Plan. However, one of the differences is that we learned anyway is how you define the term park, because what, as you can see here, with all the little trees and so on the perimeter, what the city wanted to do with this area is turn it into a park. We don't need buildings here. We want grass and trees. That's how we define a park. Well, there are lots of ways to define a park. One just has to read Jane Jacobs to learn that. But what they wanted to do here is essentially a tourist park, because this is a canal here, and that's a canal there, and across the canal from Pamahakan is Wat Saket, or the Golden Mount temple, and it's a tourist attraction. What the city planners wanted to do is create a tourist park where people could come and look at this, have a great view of Wat Saket, but it was basically for tourists. Well, what about the citizens? So we had spent a number of months with these citizens and learned a lot about what they felt their needs were. This is an example of one of the old teak houses that dotted this entire community. They had their own history. They had their own culture, but it was a vernacular culture. And as we learned about this, we felt that in some respects, their culture was made to be invisible to the broader community, and especially to the planners. This is something we don't want. We don't want to fix it up. We just want green grass and trees. End of story. And another part of that, it has to do with you know, rising land values. This is all what amounts to crown property. So if you have rising land values, then you have a better tax base too. And this is typical in any big city where your tax base is your income, so to speak, is dependent on land values. Well, of course, things are going to develop as quickly as they possibly can in order to keep those land values up and the income coming in. This community did not represent that, but they did have their own history and their own culture. And the more time we spent with them, the more we learned about that history and culture. In fact, they had their own museum in one of these teak houses. Old photographs and tools and all kinds of things that were part of that community. So they understood their community and its history, and they wanted to they were proud of that history and wanted to display it. So what we worked on with them is trying to create what amounted to pocket parks. They were trying to attract tourism because there's a lot of good money in tourism, and most people that visit Thailand wind up spending some time and some money in Ratanakosin. And they were right at the edge of Ratanakosin. The fact is, this is the old fort, Palm, the fort here, and then part of the old wall of the city was right at that edge. So they lived between the canal and the wall of the city. This is the last remaining part of the walled city. The last part of the wall is here. And so they were between the wall and the canal. They were, in essence, then outside the city, inside the canal, moat, if you will. So tourists were coming through and visiting this fort, and then where the canal is here, there was a dock. You can take what's called a klong boat right east and west through the city, virtually all the way to the new airport on a boat. That's how long this canal is. But in the 1800s, the king would come to this landing and take his royal boat through that canal to visit different parts of his kingdom. The boathouse was right here, and the dock was still there at that time. The people in the community knew that history very well, and interestingly enough, the planners did not. The people in the community had to tell the planners, look, you've got to save that building because it has this history. Listening to the people in the community can make a big difference in how we think about what we're doing in design. In any case, we worked with them for a few months and came up with, they wanted parks and the city wanted parks. Okay, well, let's have some little pocket parks in here instead of turning the whole thing into grass. The community could stay, and there would be parks as well. So this is what the students did. And then what happened is we were going to present this material to the people in the community. This was in, I think, January of 2003. We were going to make a presentation to them. And that was on a Saturday. The day before, the city came in and posted eviction notices on everybody's door and said, you've got 45 days to get out of here. So by the time we arrived with all our proposed plans for what this community could do, everybody was a little upset and glum because they had these eviction notices suddenly. Well, what we decided to do is what amounted to a feasibility report that made an argument about why this community should stay where it is and what we could do to accommodate the planners' intentions. So we did this bilingual report, and here's a page from it, that made this argument in terms of everything from Jane Jacobs to cultural rights. And part of what happened is once we presented this report to the community leaders, is they took this report directly to the planning department and said, we have a plan. Well, you can imagine what the planning department said. We don't care whether you have a plan or not. You're not planners, we are, so you can go home now and start packing. Under a lot of circumstances, what would happen with any slum community is they would offer not that much resistance. Well, the officials have said we have to go, so I guess we have to go. But this community did not do that. They resisted, and they had help. And it certainly wasn't just from our design and this feasibility study. All of a sudden, there were people coming from different universities, not just in Thailand, but Harvard University. A friend of mine who I met there, Michael Hertzfeld, an anthropologist from Harvard, was spending a lot of time in this community as well. And he gathered academics from all over the world to focus in on this community and saving it. One of the organizations that was also involved was the Center on Housing Rights and Evictions. Scott Leckie was involved with that, and what he helped the community do was to write a submission both to the National Human Rights Commission in Thailand and also to the UN High Commission for Human Rights in Geneva. That had an effect. At the same time, what was happening in the community itself is, as you can see here, there were 3 openings in the wall. This is one of those openings. And they barricaded themselves in because they were afraid that the police and the army were just going to come in and drag them all out. In the midst of that barricading, they made a submission and received a hearing from the National Human Rights Commission. I took 4 of my students to that meeting, and as you can see here on the right, all the people in the white shirts. Whoops, sorry. All the people in the white shirts here, with their backs to us, were representatives of the Planning Department, the National Housing Commission, and the Governor's Office. We were in the back row, but one of my students was eventually allowed to make a presentation, a 5-minute presentation on what we had done in the community and what the community had decided they wanted to do in their own community. We had a design. At the end of that session, the chair of that meeting, the Human Rights Commissioner, said to the assembled group, I don't see what's wrong with this plan that the community has, and I want you to cease and desist until such time as I have had the opportunity to review this plan and come to some decision about it. Amazingly enough, they ceased for a while. And so it gave the community some breathing room to continue their resistance to eviction. Well, as I sat there in that meeting and listened to the conclusions and recommendations from the commissioner, I thought, ooh, design has something to do with human rights. Here we are in the National Human Rights Commission, after all, and we're talking about design, and design was a central part of the argument to stop this eviction action. So at that meeting, I started to think about architecture and human rights, and that's how the center came to be. Well, I learned a lot over the years that I taught there. And from that, there were 5 broad areas where I saw architecture and human rights intersecting. Cultural rights, rights of access, evictions, of course, environmental rights, and workers' rights. And what came out of that is, you know, a further exploration of how those rights do intersect. And so there's a number of areas then where we're taking the example of Pamahakan. You can see in many other cities where this is having an effect. I don't know if you know the Seven Sisters Market and their resistance in keeping the market, the Latin market in Tottenham. Similar things were happening in Vancouver's Chinatown. With rights of access, this is where I found myself getting much more focused on architecture, and where I saw architects connecting directly, because typically when I talk to architects about this, their response is, I don't see what this has to do, you know, what architecture has to do with human rights. And I think a lot of the reason that response is there has to do with the enormous success of Amnesty International. So Amnesty International has had this focus, the letter writing campaigns and so on, a focus on things like torture and political persecution and so on. And so, of course, the sort of superficial understanding of human rights is based on that kind of popular understanding. It has to do with torture. Well, architecture doesn't have to do with torture. I might submit that it might have to do with that, but in other senses. However, there's a lot more to this than civil and political rights. There's economic, social, and cultural rights as well. And where I was able to connect directly with architects had to do with disability legislation, accessibility. And that's written in building codes throughout the world now. And so it's a very understandable issue for architects. Oh yeah, I know how to do it. I just follow the building code and accessibility, and we have to do that. Yes, because it's in the code. And my point to them is, no, it's not just because it's in the code. Why is it in the code? That's the issue. And that's where the issue connects to human rights. But it's in terms of access, the other issue that I was concerned with had to do with the World Charter for the Right to the City. And in that charter, what they're talking a lot about is access to the services of the city as well, to transportation, to energy, to communication, and so on. And typically, well, water. The poor don't have that same kind of access that other citizens do. Well, shouldn't they have access? Well, of course they should. How is that going to happen? Part of that is through policy, and part of it is going to be through design and what we do as designers. Forced evictions, one of the points I wanted to make here is that when you look at forced evictions, it's on a scale that is different than we might expect. It is not. These are issues of gentrification, for one thing, and that has a lot to do with land values. But it's also other forms of development. Dams, like the Three Gorges Dam example I have here, dams also displace an enormous number of people. The number of, when we think about people being displaced, we often think about conflict and political persecution, or environmental issues, flooding and so on. But a full 2/3 of the displacement of people around the world every year is due to development of one kind or another, whether it's dams or new in the city, or beautification plans like there were in Ratanakosin, or in this case in Phnom Penh. It happened in Harare too. It happens everywhere. Gentrification is not. It's a universal issue. With environmental rights, a lot of this came together for me when my students and I were working in southern Thailand after the tsunami, and what was going on there had a lot to do with Naomi Klein's disaster capitalism. People, mainly lawyers, were rushing down to the Andaman coast because all of these beaches, so to speak, had now been cleared of people. And so they were free to develop resorts and so on. This picture here at the bottom, I took when I was at a meeting with a lot of these officials, and somebody was proposing a cruise ship terminal in this little village, a fishing village that before the tsunami had about 5,000 people in it, and after the tsunami had about 1,800 survivors. And what they wanted to do here was turn this into a cruise ship terminal. And I thought, eesh, somebody's designing that. That's an architect's drawing there, for heaven's sakes. Why is this even being proposed? Being brought down from on high onto this community simply because it was devastated and essentially in some way cleared of buildings and people. We need to know where we draw the line as architects, and boy, that just seems over the line to me. So I started learning more about the land issues that were involved in this, because who owns this land, and how is it that these lawyers and architects and so on can come down from Bangkok and say, well, all this is ours now. And I wrote about that in a chapter of this book, Rebuilding After Disasters, about the land issue and how governments and communities respond to that land issue. Of course, there are quite a number of other issues, and that has to do with environmental justice, environmental refugees, the access to energy, and one that is interesting me right now a lot is the rights of nature. If you look at this organization, KELDF, they're doing a lot of work at the municipal level in putting in regulations that recognize the rights of streams and parks and so on. So finally, the last few years I was at KMUTT, I spent a lot of time with my students in construction camps in and around Bangkok. These are the people I submitted to my students. These are the people that are going to be designing the buildings that you design. They're going to be building these things. Let's see how they live and how we could improve those conditions, because the living conditions in those camps was abysmal. So we spent, I spent about probably 3 or 4 years taking students to different camps and working with the communities there, and learned a lot about not just the conditions, but the movements of people, and in particular, the fact that there are so many children that are living in these construction camps, or often on construction sites themselves. And I thought this has to stop. Well, we did in the end wind up building a school for these kids in this one particular camp. So moving forward, one of the things that I'm still focused on is trying to push the profession in a direction towards a rights-based approach. I've been talking to the UIA about this for a number of years now. Well, since the last UIA conference in Seoul, Korea, but also at the national and provincial level. I was working recently on the new edition of the Handbook of Practice for Architects. And I'll be speaking at the conference if indeed they have the conference next year. Things look kind of grim in Brazil in terms of the pandemic. We shall see. In academia, a lot of what I've been working on is writing more recently on gentrification and other issues to do with construction workers and the relationship between the conditions that these workers have on-site and off-site, and how we as architects can respond to that through contracts and other means. I was also working for a number of years on putting together a UNESCO chair in community architecture and human rights. It's still a dream of mine to get that together, and UNESCO was certainly behind it. They were a big help, but in the end, you still have to have a university to host that chair, and that proves to be difficult with funding issues and so on. In building, this is the school that we built out of bamboo in one of those construction camps, and here are a number of those kids who live in the construction camp. And then finally, I'm working mainly with ArcPeace, which is the international umbrella organization for architects, designers, and planners for social responsibility. In addition, I've been talking over the last year or so with the administration of the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, which is here on the right, about having an exhibition on architecture and human rights. So that's I guess